So for the gospel reading this morning, I've chosen a passage from Mark's gospel, and I've titled it Jesus, the Therapist Healer, because in today's story, he's not just a healer, he's a therapist as well. When you listen to the questions he's asking before he actually works the healing. And the context is, it's just after the transfiguration event, where Jesus took Peter and James and John to the top of Mount Tabor, and he's transfigured. And then they come down and they join the other disciples, and there's a huge crowd gathered at the foot of the mountain. So here's what happens. When they came to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. "What are you arguing with them about?" he asked. A man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they couldn't." "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, "How long has he been like this?" "From childhood," he answered. "It has often thrown him into the fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us." "If you can," Jesus said, "everything is possible for one who believes." Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, "I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "This kind can come out only by prayer and fasting." These are words inspired by God. I probably should have put up a little notice before I begin this homily that would say, "Viewer discretion advised," because it's an incident that happened in Kenya while I was there that's pretty horrific, but it informs kind of the content of what I'm going to do for the next 2 weeks. So at one stage, I was living in a mission called Kituro. I was there from about 1978 onwards. And occasionally I'd be asked to go to a different parish in a different diocese to do a retreat for the parishioners. So at one stage I'm invited to go to a town in Western Kenya, which was about 8 hours driving from where I lived, to give a parish retreat, a place called Kisii. So I go there and I spend a week there, delivering the retreat. And then I drive back up to my own mission. And about a week later, I get a message from the father in charge, the pastor, as we'd call him here, telling me that 3 nuns from the compound had been driving through the town of Kisii, and they got in a car accident, and they knocked down a child, and the child died on the spot. And the crowd tore them out of the car and killed the 3 nuns. So a week later, I go back down to Kisii for the funeral of these women. We attend the funeral, I stay overnight, and then I drive back up to my mission. And about 4 days later, I get a phone call from the pastor down there that the graves in which the nuns had been buried, the 3 graves, had been opened, the coffins taken out, the bodies taken out, and the heads chopped off. The bodies were left there at the side, and the heads were gone. So about a week later, the police are looking for, the culprits, and they stop a bus which is going from Kisii to Nairobi. They got a tip off, and they stop the bus, and they find 3 boxes with the heads of the 3 nuns in the boxes. And when they questioned them, they were being taken to Nairobi for black magic rituals. So if I ever had any doubt of the existence of real pure evil, that laid it to rest for me. So I'm thinking that this morning when I'm going through the stuff I'm going to speak about, because the theme I've chosen for August is illness and healing. Recently, I've had a bunch of emails from people, asking me to address this kind of issue. So over the years, I've created many models for myself in order to try to explain to myself what is illness and what is healing. So I've looked at, pain and suffering, illness and evil, and I've looked at prayer and I looked at healing. Today, I want to focus on the dark side, and the next week, God willing, I'll focus on the healing side of it. So I'll break up today's homily into kind of 8 sections. I want to look at biblical understandings of evil and pain and suffering. Then secondly, I'm going to look at what do the Hindus say about it. Thirdly, what are the Buddhist explanations for pain and suffering? Fourthly, Augustine's notion of original sin. Then fifthly, Calvin's notion of sin. Sixthly, I want to look at the homeopathic version of sickness and health. 7, I'm going to look at Big Pharma's explanation. And then finally, I'm going to play around with some models of my own that I've created over the years. So let me have a quick look then at what does the Bible say about illness and healing and demonic possession, stuff like that. So the explanation in the Hebrew scriptures and in the Christian scriptures is that all illness, whether it's physical, emotional illness, mental illness, social illness, or spiritual illness, is all the product of spirit possession. So the main source then of all illness, when you look at the Bible, is that the main source of all evil is a demon-guided, spiritless world. That's the origin of it all. So when you think then about the stories like I've mentioned today, about Jesus casting out demons, are we talking literally? Are we talking symbolically? Are we talking esoterically? In what sense was he casting out demons? Now, it's interesting to me as a psychologist that this is one of the situations. Jesus does this fairly frequently. He doesn't just respond to a request, heal my sick child. He takes a kind of a psychosocial approach to it. He wants a case history before he does the cure. So he's going to take the father aside and ask him about this little boy that I read of in today's gospel. Before he attempts the healing, he wants to know what the psychosocial background is to the case. And that's really important in understanding what healing is about and what illness is about, because there are many sources and many responses to it. Now, in spiritual literature, they differentiate between possession and obsession. So possession is kind of where a person is totally taken over by a negative energy, some kind of a demonic energy. Whereas obsession is a partial takeover. It's not as bad as full possession. So there's a variation in how the spiritual people talk about this. Now, there's been a modern resurgence in the Roman Catholic Church, a huge emphasis on exorcism, and I'm inclined to agree with it. When I look at what happened at the Paris Olympics, and I look at what happened in the European Song Contest, and I look at what happens very often in our gala events, the way in which satanic ritual becomes part of public events. So there's a new emphasis in Roman Catholicism on the importance of exorcism. Now, they're very careful to discern between psychiatric problems that masquerade as demons and the spiritual origin of demons. So part of the training then of a modern exorcist in the Catholic Church is to be trained in psychology and psychiatry, and then also in demon possession. One of the most extraordinary books I've ever read in my life when I came to the States was a book called Return from Tomorrow by a guy called George Ritchie. And George Ritchie was a young man who was conscripted in 1941 and went into boot camp as we were entering World War II. And there was a big flu going around in the camp, and quite a number of young men died because of it. And George Ritchie was one of them. He died, was pronounced dead, was taken into the morgue, and a sheet was put over his body. Somebody came in about 90 minutes later, and they noticed that there seemed to be some activity around the nostril area, and pulled back the sheet, and the young man was beginning to breathe again. So in the meantime, he had had an hour experience of being out of the body. He went on finally to become a psychiatrist himself, and a professor of psychiatry, in fact. And he wrote this book, Return from Tomorrow. And he talked about an experience he had when he was out of the body, having died. He's in a local bar surrounded by a whole bunch of other sailors and Marines and soldiers and airmen, etc. And they're all drinking very, very heavily. And it's totally crowded. And he said, I noticed that there were two kinds of beings inside in this pub. I call it a pub. Some of them had auras like real human beings, and some of them appeared to have no auras. They were these kind of bland figures. And he said at one stage, there's this young soldier walking across the bar with 2 pints in his hand, and he slips and he falls and he bangs it off the ground. And immediately he says his aura shrank down to nothing. And immediately one of the other spirits, the ones that didn't have an aura, jumped in through his crown chakra and took occupancy of his body. And the conclusion he came to as a psychiatrist finally was that any form of addiction or a kind of drunkenness of any kind, it shrinks the aura and therefore the defense mechanisms of the person, and then they can very easily be taken over by hostile kinds of energies. So I really, really believe that we should never underestimate the ability of ritual to create altered states of consciousness with its many effects on the body, on the psyche, and even societally. And so whether that the ritual is an exorcism, or is a voodoo practice, or it's a sacrament, once you put people into altered states of consciousness, then the effects that you can have on their physical health, their psychological health, and their spiritual health, and on the social health of the group is huge. So that's a lot of what the scriptures will be talking about when they talk about kind of casting out demons, or seeing that all illness, in fact, is of demonic origin. That's what they have in mind. Let me very briefly say about Hinduism, how Hinduism explains, evil or suffering or pain. And they said basically it's of two origins. The first one they call Maya, the illusion, the misidentification of the self with the ego. As long as I think I am this skin-encapsulated ego, I'm going to be subject to suffering and illness of various kinds. So misidentification of the self, the shrinking of the soul self down to the egoic body is the first cause of it. So it's the misidentification of sensory input with the mystical origins. It's the difference, I've said many times, between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. So Maya involves all of these. So Maya is a huge cause of suffering in our world. And the second one, according to Hinduism, would be the notion of karma and its reincarnational resolution. That, the law of cause and consequence means that we're constantly trying to, build upon or undo previous versions of ourselves. So karma is not a punitive mechanism whereby we're being punished in subsequent incarnations for sins we committed in previous incarnations, but rather we're dealing with the consequences of the choice we made in previous incarnations. So it's a chance to further increase and grow, or it's a chance to undo the damage we've done through past behavior. So they would, for me, then be very, very briefly the Hindu explanation for suffering. The Buddha comes along about 550 years before Jesus. And he very famously said at one stage, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. And for me, this is a huge, huge insight. There's a big, big difference between pain, which is inevitable, and suffering, which is optional. Because pain is the price of incarnation. When I come to my own theories in a few minutes, I'll expand on that a little bit. So pain is inescapable. It's part of the human condition. We cannot escape it. Suffering is very different. The Buddha called it dukkha. And he said dukkha comes from either attachment or aversion. That these are the great cause of suffering as distinct from pain. It is attachment to something or aversion to something. And therefore, dukkha, the word he gave to it then, this is the origin of all suffering as distinct from the origin of all pain, according to the Buddha. St. Augustine of Hippo was a Roman citizen, an African Roman citizen living in North Africa in Carthage before he converted to Roman Catholicism. He flourished about the year 400 of the Common Era. And Augustine was a very, very mental kind of a character, and he believed completely that the mind is the final organ of discernment. And he believed then that when we are rational, we're most in alignment with God. So he was living at a period of time when the Vandals from the north of Europe were invading Rome. And these were irrational, barbaric creatures, according to him, who had no sense of reason or mentation. And so Augustine saw Rome as kind of the intelligent, rational kind of way of governing citizens, whereas the Vandals are totally irrational beings. So reason then for Augustine is primary. Now he came to the conclusion that when a man and a woman are making love and they have an orgasm, that they're completely irrational. At the moment of orgasm, they are totally out of control. And it's at that stage that the child is conceived. And he came up with this weird notion then of original sin, that every single child is born with the stain of original sin because of the irrational behavior of his parents during his conception. And the result was, according to Augustine, because of original sin, our will is weakened, our intellect is darkened, and our bodies are subject to sickness and to death. And the Roman Catholic Church bought into that wholesale. And you and I, if you were raised Catholic, that's the notion you were brought up with, original sin, which meant that you had to be baptized immediately as a baby in case you died and went to limbo. Calvin was a Protestant Christian in the 1600s, and he was a big believer in what he would call predestination. Now, we think that predestination means, that there are some people whom God has chosen to go to heaven. No matter how badly they live in their lives, they're marked with the sign of God and they're going to go to heaven. But it was even worse than that. According to Calvin, God created most people and predestined them to go to hell. It didn't matter how they lived. So you could be a very, very good living person, but if you were predestined to go to hell, you're going to go to hell anyway. And you could be a total rake, but if you were predestined to go to heaven, you go to heaven anyway. So much of human suffering then has to do with this notion of predestination. We're stuck in a system over which we have zero control. We say something briefly about the homeopathic explanation for illness and healing. Samuel Hahnemann was a German physician born in 1755, brilliant guy. And what he observed was that when you look at a fetus developing in utero, the fetus development is cephalocaudal and proximodistal. In other words, the fetus develops from the head downwards and from the interior, the backbone, outwards. So he called it cephalocaudal and proximodistal. That's how the baby is how it develops in utero. And Hahnemann was convinced that that is exactly how healing also happens, that all healing is cephalocaudal and proximodistal. He believed that illness happens in exactly the opposite direction. So he believed that all illnesses begin with some kind of physical manifestation. Now, if you treat just the symptoms, as allopathic medicine does, you try to resolve the physical symptoms, another physical symptom will try to emerge because it's trying to express a different thing. And if you keep repressing it, eventually you're going to drive it into the emotional arena. And now the illness manifests not so much physically anymore, but emotionally, emotional disturbances. And if you keep it kind of repressing that through allopathic medicine, you drive it further still into the mental/spiritual arena. And now you've got some really big problems. Because according to Hahnemann, symptoms are not evidence of an underlying disorder. Rather, symptoms are evidence of the body's attempt to heal itself. So when you see symptoms in a homeopathic situation, you realize this is the body's reaction to the illness, and the body is trying to cure itself, and the symptoms are evidence of the body healing itself. So homeopathy will try to accelerate what the symptomology is indicating. So initially, you may get a little bit worse, but it is driving the illness much more quickly out of the system. So allopathy then, allopathic medicine, very often is actually driving the illness deeper and deeper and deeper. And the metaphor I came up with years and years ago is it's like you've got 3 warning systems. So imagine you live in a house and you've got a big fence around your property, and you have a kind of a warning system on the fence, so that if anybody climbs over the fence, a light goes on in your bedroom, warning you, there's an invader. And so you're in bed and the light goes on indicating somebody has climbed the fence into your property. And instead of investigating it, you turn off the indicator that tells you there's somebody climbing over the fence. And then a few minutes later, there's an indicator on your front door that tells you somebody's trying to actually break into the house. And the alarm goes off in your bedroom, and instead of dealing with it, you turn off this one as well. And then finally, you've got an alarm on your bedroom door, and that goes off, and at that stage, it's too late. So very, very often, that in fact is what much of allopathic medicine is doing with the symptomology. So that would be kind of a homeopathic model of it. The big pharma explanation for illness is that all illness is caused by biochemical imbalances. And therefore, the only effective cure is drugs of various kinds. So you're going to get drugs to deal with the original situation, and then you're going to get drugs to overcome the side effects of the first wave of drugs. And then you'll need a third level of drugs to deal with the second order of side effects from the drugs. And so you're caught in this spiral. So that's the pharmaceutical model, basically. Now, for the rest of the homily, I want to look at some models I've created myself over the years to try to explain to myself what is the origin, of sin and evil and illness. About 2 years ago, I had a very powerful dream. When I'm going to sleep at night, I like to seed my dreams. I ask my higher self, or God, or my angel guardian, a question, and I say, "Can you give me an answer to my question?" So about 2 years ago, I went to sleep with this idea. I would like to be able to differentiate between sin and evil. And I woke up at about 4 o'clock in the morning with this phrase burned into my mind. It said, "Sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept." In other words, sin is basically breaking a human law. Evil is different. Evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. And I've certainly seen that's true not just at an individual level. This is true at a cultural level, because a culture itself can be possessed of an evil spirit. And when that happens, the following begins to occur. Then you see the intentional breakup of the family system. You see the intentional breakup of friendships. You see the intentional breakup of all kinds of important relationships. You see the intentional corruption and sexualization of our children. You see racism and you see wokeism. You see the abrogation of basic human and constitutional freedoms, like the freedom to worship, or to travel, or to think, or to speak, or to write. Once a culture gets possessed, these are all the things that happen. And so for me, I would say that I would call it a psychosocial spiritual virus, which is much, much more deadly than COVID itself. And it's building upon the following kinds of ideas. Buddhism has this notion that they call a tulpa. A tulpa is actually a constellation of energy which is being created through our thoughts, or our words, or our deeds. Since everything generates energy, everything literally generates energy. A thought generates energy. Words generate energy. Deeds generate energy. And so at some stage, each of us is carrying around a kind of a tulpa, this gray kind of cloud, of energy that we've created through our thoughts, our words, and our actions. And so it's almost like it's personified. It's as if it has a kind of a personality of its own that can interact with me, or the ego, who I think I am. And it can take on a physical form, it can take on a psychological form, and it can take on a social form. And then we feed it through our cultures. So all of us as individuals, and as cultures, and as communities, and even as a global community, we're holding this giant tulpa. It's the result of the unacknowledged shadow. And then what we do with it, we project it onto other people. We project it onto other individuals, and we have difficulties with them. Or we project it onto another group, and we're biased against them. Or as a global community, we project it onto Mother Nature itself, and we devastate it. It's like the great Pacific garbage patch in the Pacific Ocean, where all of this debris and rubbish from the west coast of North America, and from the east coast of Asia, and from all the ships at sea that are constantly dumping crap into the oceans. And now there's a garbage patch in there because of the nature of the tides, which is actually bigger than the state of Texas. Now, we're doing that psychologically as well, and we're doing that spiritually as a community. The next element for me would be, I look at the notion of service to self versus selfish service to other. If you take a spectrum, the A street is where there's total service to self, narcissism, and B street is total service to other, the Mother Teresa of the world. Every single one of us is born at A street. Every little infant is born as a narcissist, and he must do. In order to survive infancy, he needs milk, he needs mama, he needs cuddling, he needs warmth. So we're total narcissists to begin with. But in the course of our lifetime, we're meant to move finally until we move into compassion and love. But very, very often, if we remain in service to self, the narcissistic infant becomes greedy, and then avaricious, and then angry, and then becomes a violent adult or a group. Now, the trick somehow is to be able to look at all of the experiences of my life, all of the events and all the relationships in my life, and to somehow harvest them. Now, we have to differentiate then between the thing in itself and the opportunity to harvest it. And my favorite parable in which Jesus deals with this issue is called the parable of the unjust steward. He tells a story about a rich man who had a steward whom he placed in charge of all his property. This guy was in charge of the books. And then after years and years and years, he found out that this guy was embezzling from him. So he calls him, he says, I need to see the books. And the guy thinks, holy God, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to get a real job. I'm too embarrassed to beg. So he calls in all his master's debtors and he says, Michael, how much do you owe my master? 50 gallons of wine. Here's your bill, change the 50 to a 30. Mary, how much do you owe my master? I owe 100 bushels of wheat. Here's your bill, make it 80. So he's going to get a bakshishi when he's fired. He's going to go to Mary and Michael and say, okay, I helped you out. You help me out now. And then Jesus said a very strange thing. He said, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, was he praising the steward's duplicity? Obviously not. What he was saying was, this was a guy who could turn every situation to his own economic advantage. When he was employed, he was embezzling. But even when he got fired, he was able to get bribes, from the debtors. So Jesus is saying, why is it that you can't turn every situation you encounter to your own spiritual advantage? So harvesting life is so important. Harvesting life is much more important than actually just experiencing life and responding to it. So then I started creating kind of models, putting together factors that, for me, kind of explain what illness is about. So the first version I came up with many, many years ago, I called it the 6 factors of illness. And I believe that basically with any illness, there are 6 factors involved. And I'll name them and then explain them. The first one is genetic predisposition. The second one is environmental influence. The third one is personal lifestyle. The fourth one is personal belief system. The fifth one is karma. And the sixth one is bodhisattva. So let me just unpack those for a few minutes. So the first factor is genetics. So very often there are particular cultures who are kind of predisposed to particular kinds of illnesses. So there are some groups, for instance, who are kind of much more likely to get sickle cell anemia than other groups. There are some groups who are much more likely to get diabetes than other groups. The same thing in individual families within the culture, maybe heart disease is in the family, or strokes are in the family. And then there's the kind of the individual person, your own unique genetic makeup. So that's a predisposing kind of factor for the illnesses you're going to experience. So that's factor number 1. Factor number 2 then is environment. And by that I mean everything from the in utero experience of the developing embryo, to the environment of the family in which you grew up, to the environment of the neighborhood in which you lived, and to the environment of the culture of which you are a part. So these environmental influences have a huge effect on the illnesses you're going to experience. The third factor, I believe, is personal lifestyle. So am I a couch potato? I spend all my time sitting on the sofa, with the remote, watching football games. I got an atrocious diet. I never exercise. So my personal lifestyle will contribute to the illnesses I experience. Number 3. Number 4, then, I would say, is the personal belief systems. Am I a happy or a hopeless person? Do I feel victimized or empowered in life? Am I atheist with no belief in an afterlife or a higher consciousness, or am I a spiritual person? So these personal belief systems, research has shown are hugely kind of correlated with good health or poor health. So that would be factor number 4. Factor number 5, I would say, is karma, both good and bad karma, cause and consequence. That there are some lessons which are so big and so important that we devote several incarnations to working through particular issues. And so sometimes an illness will be part of the lesson I need to learn in order to grow. So that would be karma as a 5th consideration. And then the sixth one would be the Bodhisattva vow. According to Buddhism, there are some beings, they call them bodhisattvas, who are so advanced that they have no personal karma to work out. But they keep coming back, they keep reincarnating in order to wake up the rest of us. Now, I think there's a little bit of the bodhisattva in every single one of us. Anybody who's volunteered for earth incarnation has an element of the bodhisattva. And so we may experience an illness because we want to embody an illness to give others the opportunity of exercising compassion, or for medicine, the opportunity of developing responses to the illness. So for me, they were the kind of the 6 factors of illness. Now, when I look at number 1 and 2, genetics and environment, eventually science will figure out the answer to these 2 pieces. If it's number 3 or 4, if it's personal lifestyle or personal belief system, you have 100% control over your own health insofar as it's affected by these 2 factors. 100% control. If it's number 5 or 6, if it's karma or the bodhisattva vow, then this is your soul's mission. And no matter what you do, you won't heal the illness or the problem because your soul has committed and volunteered to experience that for other reasons. And the final differentiation is really, really important. It is much more important to know the purpose of an illness rather than the etiology of an illness. The etiology just tells you how you got to be as sick as you are. The purpose tells you, why are you experiencing this kind of illness? Is it a soul lesson? Is it kind of selfish life behavior? Or is it a scientific matter? So that was the first model I came up with years and years and years ago. Over the last few months, I've been looking at another 6-stage model, drawing from many, many systems. So in this model, the first stage, or the first factor, is the stories and the interpretations and the explanations we tell about our pain. So I agree with the Buddha that pain is inevitable. It's the price of incarnation. But suffering is optional, because suffering always is the result not of the pain, but the stories and the interpretations and the explanations we foist on our pain. And so at one stage in my office in Los Altos, I was seriously tempted to put a notice on my door that said, when clients were coming in, a notice that said, change the bloody story. That so much of our suffering is the result of the stories we're telling ourselves about the pain we're experiencing. So that would be factor number 1. Factor number 2 in this model, I would then call acts of God, or natural disasters. So you and I have volunteered to live on a planet that is subject to earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, volcanoes, even meteor impacts. And so, a lot of our suffering is going to come from the fact that we live on this planet. Now, under the same kind of umbrella, acts of God, if you're of a fundamentalist mindset, you could also include direct punishment by God for your sins. So fundamentalists would claim that God punishes us for our sins by visiting all kinds of illnesses upon us. So that would be an act of God. And polytheists in the past had the belief system that we were just suffering on planet Earth was kind of, I would say, like collateral damage, as the gods in the skies were kind of duking it out among themselves in the heavens. So we were the collateral damage to the gods kind of at war with each other. So that would be the kind of acts of God. That would be factor number 2. If you believe in the Gaia hypothesis, that Gaia itself, is a living being animated by an extraordinary soul, and I certainly subscribe to that. That is an extraordinary intelligent entity. It's a Mahatma, a great soul. Now, if I believe that Gaia is an intelligent being, is it possible that nature herself is occasionally giving us blowback in response to environmental insult? Because when you disturb the carefully crafted balance of the natural world, it will always strive for homeostasis. And that sometimes involves kind of what we would describe like as violent mood swings in order to right the ship. So that would be like a kind of an anthropomorphic form of what I would call nature karma, that nature in trying to kind of balance itself, is visiting various kinds of situations on us. So that would be a third factor. The fourth factor then would be the very makeup of our physical spacesuits. These spacesuits we inhabit, they're wired for aging, they're wired for illness, and ultimately they're wired for death. These were not meant to be immortal garments. Rather, we all agree to eventually shuffle off this mortal coil. And so the realization that it is the nature of the spacesuit to wear out, and so we're going to experience, the suffering of some kind. Factor number 5, I would say then, is kind of conflict, interpersonal, intercommunal, and international conflict, violence, war, theft, lies, etc. So we have managed to kind of create a lot of what I would call suffering-causing agents in our arsenal of responses to life. It's almost as if we are born into and marinated in a world that has cultivated selfishness and sin. And that, for me, is what original sin really is. It's not Augustine's version. It's the fact that every single one of us is born into a world and marinated and cultivated in a world which is full of selfishness and sin to begin with. And ultimately, there is only one sin, I'm convinced. You know, breaking commandments or stealing, or telling lies or whatever, there are second or third order sins. The only sin really, there's only one sin, and that is the refusal to wake up to the soul and its mission. And finally, perhaps number 6, most devastating of all, is our identification with the ego. I agree completely with Hinduism here. The identification with the ego and the concomitant sense of separation from God, separation from others, and separation from nature. When we dissolve that separation and we realize that there is only God, that everything that exists is a word of God made flesh, then suffering dissolves. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.